As you know, council officers do not have individual budgets. There is no travel allotment paid for council. And so when that opportunity came up, we were sort of scrambling to figure out, one, how it could happen. And it actually ended up taking a what we need to understand as an administration, or if there is a council intent in the future to consider travel possibilities. We do distinguish between protocol requirements. There's things where only the mayor is invited at Arbor. So from our vantage point, the mayor needs to be there when those occur. The Germany trip was clearly a one-off very often, and we needed to do it in a certain way because they intended to. Or were already and they are looking at the titles of their sending. That's clearly a one-off situation. If you were considering, I guess, guidance from the administrator's office, we would ask that you consider policy development areas where you feel like you don't have sufficient knowledge, gain knowledge on something before legislating. If those were areas that could be identified, then we could figure out as the budget being developed. This year we're studying X. There is a desire of the council perhaps to go to a location that is already has a model or something to study. Additional areas, however, that would be up for consideration and really fall more to council than to the administration is how to determine who goes. Because my office is getting questions around that. We're not in a position. What are we trying to achieve? You know, question we would ask. So just sort of thinking out loud around that. If the policy implications are going to have a direct application to a ward or well, that would make sense to travel. If the policy also relates to areas where we have a council member that's a mission rep, then that would seem to be a factor to consider. If we have council members that have a certain level of subject matter expertise already in the area, other considerations. The one thing that clearly should not be an element of consideration, which should never be an individual's ability to pay. And that came up during this. It was very uncomfortable and, in my view, inappropriate. If you're traveling for the city, you're traveling for the city regardless of how much you have in your bank. So, we need some guidance from you on what we don't know. And if we have it as we're starting to develop a budget, then I can work with that with CFO. Any city-related travel, you have to adhere to the rules that are already in place. Special provisions made for council members. Planning ahead is better because, as you know, costs fluctuate ahead. You had to do one day before going to do. I do. So that's sort of our take on what we're asking you to consider tell us if we want to continue to treat it as a one-off, and you were to say to the administrator's office, we can't possibly foretell what policy might be, then as I plan the budget, I would want to have allocation that's parked and it sits there and it lapses end of the fiscal year, if it's not used. And then it comes back, and then if there's something where you have to do it, we look at that line item versus mending the budget to allow this year. The other thing I'd ask you to consider, you should consider how many together here. This particular trip had 5. Any questions for me on this?
Glad you're bringing this up. I mean, I think there hasn't been clarity around this, even from my perspective as a council member. It's not been clear how folks are selected for trips. We're on Energy Commission. There's different pieces. I think having clarity around policy on this is important. So I guess my question for you is, are you suggesting that you might draft something and bring it back to us on something, or you want us to draft something and bring it back to you, or what is?
I'm not asking you to draft anything, but I'm asking. If you need me to do that, I can. It really comes down to what is your goal. Typically, staff gathers information. We're the ones out. It's usually not a legislative. In our government, the council role is a part-time position that doesn't have an office budget. So whoever created started whenever it was. But things have to evolve. And I do think it's valid for critical areas, and thermal as an example, area the country is learning. We do not have internal expertise. And staff is not the ones that have to cast a vote. Why? So I think that trip was relevant, clearly, because you all are the ones that will have to get whatever policy or no policy. There are other things where it's, given the nature of what it is, for natural, wasn't one of those areas. At all.
So is this thing, they're separating out these information gathering. There's also, remember my HR orientation, there's money for conferences. Like, is there some council amount conferences or other?
My understanding is that at one point in time there was $200 office. For the most part, it never fit. Yeah. I'm not aware that it still actually exists. And so what really triggered this is there was a request around travel, but no mechanism to enable travel. So if this were a staff request, that's easy. I would just say, no, you can't do that. But that's not what this was. So the request is simply if you intend to do it again in the future and you want it, either budgetarily or operationally possible, then we can't just treat it as a one-off. That we can figure out how.
I mean, my feeling about that particular trip is really unusual. It's completely necessary, but not something that's going to come up very frequently. I mean, we're looking at, making a transition in our community that with all new infrastructure, in a way that hasn't happened in like generations. And there's nowhere in Michigan that you could go and see it up close. So while at the same time, I feel like it's really it was a real one-off. I do see that it would make sense to have just the placeholders in the budget, but also to have some really strict rules around how we decide whether something rises to the level being necessary to use, so that we're not using it just to use it,
Right.
but that there are protocols and goals and objectives in place that can be evaluated. I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I feel somewhat similarly. I think I've also heard about this fund for councilman when I got elected. I heard that maybe it was $500 or and
Yeah.
at the time that I was elected, we were in COVID, and so I even think about there's a Michigan Municipal League new elected officials conference that I was able to participate in virtually because it was COVID, but I believe has returned to in person, and like $200 isn't going to cover even travel to a conference in the state of Michigan. And so that may speak to why maybe it wasn't being used. But I do think maybe needs to be some conversation around those types of uses, like more professional development, elected official training, or like I've only gone once now, but there's an annual LGBTQ elected officials conference that I have attended where like I come out of that with tons of ideas from other cities because it brings elected officials from all over the country. I pay for that out of pocket. I can afford to go. But there are maybe opportunities for council members to make that potentially more affordable for them. I was lucky in that instance that I could afford to go. I didn't go last year. But there, I think, are opportunities where there are learnings or development opportunities, or frankly, just information gathering opportunities that I think are valuable. But I agree. I don't want to create a fund that is just like, oh, I've got this money, so I need to travel.
Well, and that's a little different too, and I think that there's a place for that as well. I think I'd love to know if we could ourselves against others, what they do in terms of elected officials going to conferences like that, leadership development. I'd really be curious to know that. I mean, I think the geothermal trip with several people going all at once was a very rare thing, but certainly opportunities do exist for professional development in the realm of elected officials, and it is worth looking at.
To be clear, because I actually don't know, the geothermal trip was the negotiation team, like the 5 members were all of it. So council is as the negotiation staff.
it's the working.
I can actually answer your question now. What Henry is, there's affordability. Typically, cities that they would be cities where each council person would spend it on. The reason they set it up that way is, you know, politely put, it's an absolute headache. I mean, we don't have anybody to do it. And so if you have $100, you have $100. You don't spend it, that's fine. But I'm trying to keep track of it. Problematic. And those cities that do it, council often sends that council police for that year.
Yeah, I think it's wondering, cities like us, you know, it sounds like you're talking about cities.
I can talk to some of the city managers.
I mean, I do think it's relevant to bring back up that sort of $500 that we allocated. When we first came in, I did use it to go to the MML as well, and I think we should maintain that. If increasing it a little bit, that might cover this sort of go to travel to one conference sort of thing, and that you're, you know, not everything's covered out of it, but makes it a lot more affordable. Yeah. So, yeah, I think we should encourage us. The topic areas, but also.
An opportunity, I think of, for example, national policy. I mean, I go to that, you know, for business purposes, but I tend to spend at least half my time, you know, people talking to me about city issues. You know, but of course, in the pocket. But it's, you know, it's like 3 solid days of a lot of information sharing and gathering. And so that's a key. Okay.
Can I keep going there?
Yeah.
All right, so, council calendar and what things there. The administrator's office has heard variety of ways. We want work sessions to come back. We've also heard that videos not really a thing. That's okay on our end because it takes a lot of time to make them, but it also takes a lot of work. A lot of lead time, and depending on the topic, can involve people outside the government. And the one we're looking at now is really not a all. I'll be probably 100% that app, and we're combining it now. So the work that we need there, figure out how topics would be decided. My understanding is you do it before, you stop doing it. And as I've shared with some of you, it's challenging for staff
who comes to work every day and we just work on it. And one of the things I heard when I got here was not satisfied with the communication that comes to. I feel like I have solved that. You know, I need to start. So it's hard for me to judge or for the staff to determine what you want to know more that would require work session. Because to us, it's just we're doing. But we're going to be able to put our foot in the water and this fall, the way it shapes up, we're going to have 5 meetings in a row. The last week in September will be Missy doing a work session. In October, we've got the regularly scheduled council meeting. We've got the DDA work session, which would be at CCN, which we didn't do last year, but we must do this year, because we are talking about parking, and I gave you a year's notice that we're going to raise rates. So that's now coming. And then there is the housing homelessness session. So recognizing that everyone or a lot of people have schedules and other things, the 5 weeks in a row is going to be a hard stretch for staff. We're going to do it. And I think it may be a hard stretch for some of you. But if we're going to do work sessions, it's easier if we kind of know when they would fall. And the request that we would make is write the language that's flexible in a manner that doesn't take a whole lot if the meeting's not that. So you don't have to go change council rules, all that. There's nothing to talk about. There's just no meeting. So, and the other part of that is I'm suggesting that council members sort of look at it on the calendar itself, because there's some natural times that selectively we just don't want to meet. We don't want to meet this week in January. We don't want to meet, there's other days. Well, let's just consciously look at it. And certain days and Sarah and whoever else is involved with the calendar, just go ahead, stay early, plan on meeting. I know we're boxed in here, unlike other places. Other cities don't have that, and so they can just cancel. We won't meet. You just roll it together, embedded in our rules and made public, and so there's more that this encourages. So you have comments on work session?
Yeah, so I had a conversation with Mr. Dohoney because a number of colleagues have come to me as well asking for more information or work session opportunities. We've obviously seen some of those come by email. And I think what I wanted to gather from this group is how we go about doing exactly what we just heard, which is figuring out how we determine if something rises to the level of a work session. Obviously, like if every single one of us might have an interest area, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should have a work session on every single topic. Sometimes it can just be a council member having a more in-depth conversation with member staff. And so wondering if there is a process by which this group is helping to determine when we schedule out a work session. When we had our conversation, kind of having that flexibility to say, like, these are the dates or times of the week that we might try to do a work session if one is scheduled, but that there's not just a standing meeting. It's an opportunity to schedule something because we know that it's going to require some staff work to build out the content and to make sure that we have people there that are scheduled to be able to speak and present. And so acknowledging that if we have some sort of process, that there's also a uniform understanding amongst council members that this isn't something that's just going to happen overnight, but actually is a process that requires some scheduling and requires some thought on what the agenda. So I was hoping to gather some feedback from this group. And I am happy to take a crack at working with, the clerk staff and others to actually draft something to reestablish that, but wanted to not just do that on my own, wanted to work with all of you.
It makes a lot of sense to have this group weighing in on that, particularly because I would get the council of our city administrator at the same time. I don't know if we need more parameters or a way of, if there's that we.
I mean, in years past, they were on the calendar. They were there to be had, and they were eventually there to be canceled if nothing rose. And essentially, it was, the administration committee. The administration committee is not ad hoc, but it seemed like a topic gave rise to a level where that conversation was greater, realized it, council members initiated it, and they said, well, how about we do it on the second Monday of December, and it was done. Second Monday of November, probably second Monday of December, done. I don't think there's any why we need to have them on the schedule. If we don't want to get into the business of we might have a soft understanding that they're going to be on the second Monday, the intervening Monday, and then if we do determine that there is a subject that is used for a work session, then all the special meeting, even though we super special, but anticipated session.
And I know, from the virtual work sessions that I participated in, we first elected, that we always tried to keep them to 2 hours. And there were parameters around the meeting. And so I also don't know. I think
Subject will be.
of course, yes.
There's no reserve.
Correct. And so I do think that I think having staff weigh in on some of this is helpful in that I think we all have acknowledged that sometimes there are big topics that are coming up that it's maybe helpful for all of us to have a mutual understanding on at a relatively similar time. And then I think there are just areas where we have a relatively young council, that there are just some issue areas that continue to be a focus for council that folks I think would like to dig in a little deeper with staff. And so providing those opportunities and at least a process for establishing that council.
Do we think it's something as simple as have a topic, if 6 council members want to talk about it, open meeting, and then that would be the kind of application, in the sense of if people essentially vote for it. I don't know what the process is.
I don't know how we do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think there's a threshold. I think there's a threshold, but I don't think
we know it's 5. Yeah, we know it's 5.
I would,
I don't know.
yeah, I would prefer to have, that I'm reserving that second Monday, 7 p.m., that is going to be the time that we are potentially having travel and exams, and I think we need to reserve something fairly regular. From the staff perspective, generating ideas. I mean, if there are major projects that are being worked on, they're looking at here. I think even if, and we know that we're going to have to vote on something at some point, I think those are good things to maybe, if there had been work sessions this year, that would have been an important, and I'm sure that looking at and that should be an area that we can identify. What are those major projects? Sustainability is going to be tough, and we're talking about lots of ordinances and brought forward that are going to be massive. There are going to be big changes for the community, and we need to have a collective of those issues. You know, excitement and a lot of resistance too. And so I think sustainability issues are might for some time, for at least a couple of work sessions per year, I can imagine. But, and then for these off-topic ideas, housing and homelessness, that's really unconventional. My understanding of what I've done in the past probably should be some admin that says, okay, does this make sense? Something that is better for a couple of people. A group that could take those ideas that are generated by other members of council and say, okay, this is do we think this should be programmed in later? And
I also think it's important to differentiate between a work session's need or ability to allow us to have dialogue and provide some direction or at least some clarity around where council's thinking might be versus something that's maybe just an update or a presentation from staff. And in that case, I do think there's an opportunity for us to maybe take advantage of more of a 15 to 20 minute presentation on our existing council meeting, where we had a bit of a presentation from Missy this week that didn't require a huge dialogue. It was more of an update on where things are. That's informational and doesn't require.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think the only place I would add, I would say, I think on our response, conversations around that may eventually arise. And then the other thing I think is just the budget, because you're talking about like the video, you got back to the video as presentation. So it's like if we saw it, work sessions and then right there, and that's like 6 or 7. We've already got, it's an interesting discussion when we talk about videos. We're to be serving the pleasure of I'll just say the finance department. We found the budget related because that's not, you're simply hearing departments say out loud what they're asking. It may never make it in the budget, but yet we end up having conversations around what about this, about that, one item that's for some of the reason it's not there. Proposed budget. So if the budget related work session is for you to hear what service areas, but it may not go any further than that. But it should.
I do think, I do think there is value in knowing what, a perfect world would look like for our departments. If, the budgets are conversations about trade-offs. And so, knowing what's on the plan or on the roadmap for each department is valuable. But I do think, particularly this year, I think there was more need for us to have conversations together about what some of the priorities were, and just to make sure that I know that from some of the conversations that we had, I'm trying to remember, was it budget related when we had the working session or the presentation from, it was budget, where we got to have some conversation around, pre-funding, and we got like different pieces from everyone, and we asked questions that were based off of the conversations other people were, and the questions they were asking. You think of things differently when you're hearing somebody else talk about something. You might have missed something that somebody else mentioned, and then it spurs another question. And I do think that's valuable, particularly.
You might be referring to the planning session.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm referring to. Thank you. That's right. That is exactly what.
And we're still gonna have that.
Yeah.
We just don't know what the topic.
So in terms, it seems like there's a little consensus on setting aside dates, at least as a matter of, general information. Not putting it on the calendar. We don't want to. But have a generally understood second Monday in the month, subject to vagary, as a likely work session target. Seems like there's.
So this is not, like how far in advance is it? No, a month.
For everyone, including the public.
You could have it on the calendar and is a notice sufficient?
I mean, if Jackie's gonna have it on the official calendar, so that, it will be on the calendar, and she'll have to note it as. So when you go to that tab on the government, tab on the website, where you look at the meeting, it will be listed there, and then. Is that the question?
Yeah,
Well, how does that happen?
It's listed as canceled on the calendar.
I might just tell her.
But also, so I mean, I think the other reason I think there's value in keeping flexibility is that we did acknowledge that sometimes some of the work sessions require us to schedule outside people, and so there may be times that the only way that we can get it done is not the first or the second Monday. And so like that's the target. But then I do think there is confusion if it's advertised out as being that date and then it's not going to be that date. Where instead we can just proactively advertise that something is. And it allows flexibility in that scheduling. I know that we have a goal of keeping it consistent for planning purposes, but if there's a topic we all need to talk about and the only way that we can get a Wednesday, then I think it does create some confusion. But
So would that be a special meeting? If that's what we call it.
I think
And the rules of working session of the council maybe scheduled for the other day of other locations provided that such changes to the regular.
like,
we actually have
all we have to do is start doing them.
But I think we need to determine what do we want the threshold to be to say that, because we have gotten some like individual council members who said, I want a work session. Is that enough to schedule a work session? Probably. So.
It's really like there are 5. Like it's not exactly an executive we have that discussion at some point.
Yeah.
About, like, perhaps this is the body. Identified.
And do we have those requests submitted through the administrator's office and you bring them to admin, or?
That's the answer. There's a lot of staff scheduling associated. Unless the administrator's office thinks that's unwise.
No, it is wise. We can say we had a request for work session and bring it here and see if that is sufficient enough to do it.
Again, you?
It does take a lot of work, when you just talk from the clerk's office and CPN, making sure we have the space. You know, typically we would just always have the calendar where we have all the council dates. And we would always have meetings in February and March, second and fourth Monday. And then we always have the second Monday in December. And that was how we did it before we.
I will have a conversation with the clerk's office, maybe.
You're suggesting that it's by having the numbers. I believe with this,
What we need to go to anything?
No, because I think it's still coming back afterwards.
I'm happy to participate.
All right.
Thank you.
Jackie and I usually draft it.
Yeah, and I think there's some desire to make sure that we're looking out, so that there's not an expectation that all of a sudden we've got a bunch ready to go. Because there's, yeah.
Thank you. The next item on your agenda, was right now, I have to. The next item on the agenda is my performance evaluation, which was supposed to be done in August, so let me first start with apologies for one taking vacation and then falling terribly ill, which has set us back, by 2 months. But I have worked with, Amy Fell, and I did, ask them to help with the process simply because I wanted somebody who's been through it once to help with it. So I have worked with Amy and come up with a schedule that I shared with you by email, but I have copies here if you'd like to see it again. And it sort of lays out a schedule for, how things would progress. And if we follow this schedule, the final report should be ready for council. Final report should be ready for the council meeting on October 6th. But the first thing that happens is on August 29th, this committee receives questions or draft questions that will be sent by survey. So it'll be a 360 feedback from my team, from my peers, Milton and his direct reports, and of course from my supervisors, all of you. So it will include feedback from all of that. So you will have the opportunity to review the questions that will be shared, that will be answered. Amy and I will take your feedback and finalize the questions. So you next meet on September 12th. On September 12th, we will seek your feedback on the questions. You will have them on August 29th, so you have roughly 2 weeks. When we have received your feedback, we'll finalize the questions and then open the survey on September 18th. It's booked 2 weeks. It closes on October 2nd. Amy then provides me a raw report because I get to respond to the raw report in writing. So I get it on October 4th. I respond by October 6th. And then she generates a report for the city on October 6th itself, so within hours. You have an opportunity to review it. You next meet after that on October 10th. So you can provide, any comments to the report. And at that time, I'm requesting and hoping that you will upward adjust the salary as well and, make a recommendation to. And then that recommendation and the report will be shared with the council on top. That's sort of the timeline. So, and if you have any comments on this, and, you know, not just today, but after today, please feel free to let me know, and of course. Any initial thoughts? Okay, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nothing to be voted on. Okay.
All right,
I'm thinking of like, um, I've got a meeting, so my request would not be a three. And my industry as city manager is only 1.5 years. I've only been here not 2 years. And when I read through what Sarah showed me, the process, I had issues with the wording. In my opinion, it is not proper for former council members to evaluate because they're not here. They don't know what I'm. That's what it is. It should be a review to why report to and the people that report. Want to ask the entire workforce, you know, questions need to be a little different. They're not really seeing what's really going on. They're at a much lower question than people that are reporting. I'll be able to give you a timeline after I have my conversation Tuesday. And I work under a different contract in that I'm not eligible to receive a raise this year, so simply evaluate. So
as I recollect, the former council member, inquiry or inclusion was, part of that. The timing of the evaluation was germane to that conversation. It was a one-off. In a way that I don't.
okay.
After reports directly to you, council. That makes sense. Your guys' relationship, I think, is kind of odd in the organization, but it's sort of a pure relationship, I could imagine that. But,
I'm fine with Kathleen, but she's my peer.
I know.
Per the charter.
Exactly.
This,
Yeah, that's the only other sort of.
I'm fine with that.
That on its way.
Yeah.
Excellent. Is there any information or upcoming business?
You had mentioned that you wanted this to become a place where Kathleen or I could periodically update or list out things. I think at some point TC1. Because when I look at it, it's a policy. And in order for the policy, we're now calling for sort of begs the question, do we have capacity internally to do that? I'll give you an example. Just take one quarter. Some other state out there, wherever it is, if there were actual people wanting to take advantage of basketball, and they came to us to say, TC1 is passed, I've got control of X fan, I want, we would struggle to make, because we don't have it that has the capacity.
That's planning, engineering.
It's a lot. So without naming projects, let's just say if there was a project that needed to be worked on that was actually, I would have to personally, and I'm not saying that it's not a kind of thing. We just not have people here that have certain that level of capacity or experience. And you know, if I'm trying to do everything else, it's hard to say, yeah, I can do this one thing. But if I needed to do that times 6, it would be a problem. So at some point, we're going to have to talk about our ability to have policy that requires an internal level.
I will say that, so the idea that we would be making some zoning changes that refers to greater development in certain areas. One of the main reasons behind the building and development process review and so I'm really looking forward to getting that report back. I think it's coming in the next month or so. Yeah, and, right. And so hopefully that will be streamlining things. But it sounds to me like you're not just talking about capacity in terms of streamlining, you're talking about certain skill sets that you may not have.
In order to really do what I think we want to do, certain people are dedicated. We got 25 things that they can do part of that. That's going to always be. And that's one of the reasons, you know, they come, I'm ready to go. Yes. Everybody's doing it. But we have a number of one person's on vacation, so involved. I'm not trying to have a conversation today. I'm just saying at some point I think we're going to need to talk about what the expectation is. How will they be able to execute or you think whatever.
So A lot more complexity than I envisioned it. So PC1 is just one zoning category of many in the land is zoned now, but I think there's it sort of with a change the look of it. Don't want to just be passive and sort of see what happens and maybe or maybe somebody does purchase, they actually do have a vision for this and they really that we need that capacity to be able to proactively sort of realize this vision and that's how you're seeing it, as opposed to I was like, well, it's just another.
The way
we would want it, but you know.
the way I would respond, if we're saying as a government, we're open to more development. So we passed enabling legislation for vertical development to happen. The logical thing that has happened, the way I look at it, is now needs to be pointed to look for people who will consider building in the corner that we said open for business. Not waiting on someone to learn about it, figure it out. Oh, hey, you know, you can be getting after it. Because that, my experience is that's the only way it's going to really happen. You might have a local person who's in that business, desire to do something, but what we're actually doing is setting the community. And we're saying, we want this. We're saying, you now can do vertical development by right. Then we have to let the world know, hey, that opportunity. That's how the tax base, that's how our revenue increases, make it happen, rather than we're hoping somebody knows about it and comes. And so the flip side of that, if a bunch of people did know and come and say, hey, we want to do this, with just the people we have. Okay.
You score? That's the sort of thing we're looking for. Yeah. In terms of information. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Public comment, we have two people who are online. If anyone who is listening would like to speak at public comment, please enter *9. Public comment is 3 minutes. These will help you with your talk. No one? Public comments first. We're going to adjourn. Please move by. Either comment or discussion. All in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned.